Hi, so today we are going to talk about how you can select strong evidence. So, if you've looked at the lessons for the week, you might have noticed that we are preparing you for a debate on things fall apart. In order for you to debate effectively and successfully, it's important that you know how to select the best piece of evidence to back up your claims. Remember, a huge part, or rather a large part, of your grade for your discussion is based on you making insightful claims, but also having the best piece of evidence or a strong piece of evidence to back up that claim. So, this might be a review for a lot of you, but we're going to talk a little more in depth about how to select evidence. And this is also a skill that you consistently build over high school, so it's always good to go through it again. All right. So, you always want to think to yourself, what is the goal of my evidence? And largely, the goal of your evidence is to prove or justify your claims. When we say claims, we mean those conclusions or those inferences that you're making. Your evidence must always be relevant, sufficient, and representative. So, what does that mean? Well, if your evidence is relevant, this means that it proves your claim, right? If you're saying that Othello breaks gender stereotypes, you need a quote that shows him breaking gender stereotypes. It needs to be relevant to your claim. Your evidence also must be sufficient. So, what that means is there's enough within your quote to prove your claim. So, we're always pushing you to zoom in on word choice. So, maybe it's a word or a phrase, but again, there's enough of that word, or it's a powerful enough word or phrase that it actually proves your claim. The final criteria for this is representative. So, what that means is that you're picking a piece of evidence that accurately represents the text and that shows kind of the complexity of a character or a theme or a conflict. You want to keep in mind that you want to avoid overly simple quotes. The problem with overly simple quotes is that they do not lend themselves easily to further analysis or discussion. Often, overly simple quotes lead to overly simple conclusions that are not insightful or arguable. And I have an example of that down below. So you're going to make a conclusion. 1984 takes place in early spring. And the evidence for that, it was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. While that's a nice quote to choose, the conclusion that it takes place in early spring, we're not really going anywhere, right? That's not really arguable. If I threw that into the discussion, you guys would all look at me and be like, okay, duh, yeah, where do we go from here? So you want to make sure that when you're pulling out evidence, you're pulling out evidence that people can talk about, that maybe leads to more questions and more room for people to disagree with you or agree and build on. Okay. So then some of you might be thinking to yourself, well, how do I know if my evidence is strong enough? So you want to find quotes that do one or more of the following. So the quote should have information or word choices that teach you something significant about a character or a theme. So you're able to come to a deeper understanding of that character or theme, right? You're seeing how a specific character is more complicated than you originally thought, or you're starting to see what an author is teaching you about a specific theme. A strong quote could also develop or contribute to a conflict that emerges around your theme. So maybe the quote shows you something about the cause of a conflict or the effects of a conflict. And when you're looking at the causes and effect of a conflict, that's always teaching you something about a theme. If you go back to your reading of Othello, you were learning a lot about how gender stereotypes and gender roles caused conflicts. All right. Strong quotes could also connect to patterns emerging in a text. You might see a word, an idea, a color, an object coming up again and again, and this repetition may lead you to make a conclusion or an inference. And finally, strong quotes feature notable language that is interesting or strange. You want to look for words or phrases that contradict what you expect or what is normally expected. If you think back to ninth grade when we read Frankenstein, a quote that Robert Walton says is, "I desire to possess a friend." It is really strange to use the word possess when talking about having a friend, right? Because it's that idea that you want to own your friend. So that's a great example of interesting or strange language. Notable language also includes specific words or phrases that have associations, really, really specific associations or extreme meanings. So the word parent you often associate with love and protection, or the word hate has an really extreme meaning, right? It's that extreme dislike. So often when you're looking at words that have really definitive connotations, those are good words to use for evidence because you're going to have a lot to peel apart or analyze there. And finally, strong quotes might have figurative language. So, metaphor, simile, imagery, personification, any of those figurative language examples that we've talked about throughout the year. So, this is kind of just like a neat little checklist. Not every piece of evidence is going to meet each criteria, but I would make sure that it meets at least one of the top three, and then it definitely meets one of these bullets for notable language. So let's just do a little practice quickly together before you go off and you look for evidence and things fall apart. So this is kind of just like an example claim. It may or may not be true. It's definitely arguable. But the point of this practice example is for us to think about which piece of evidence is best to support this claim. So, William Shakespeare's Othello demonstrates that when masculinity is defined by having ownership or total control over the women or over women, men are forced to take extreme and violent measures to obtain that level of control. So, which piece of evidence meets all of the criteria we've talked about: relevant, sufficient, representative, and then features at least one of these checklist items? So, choice one: thieves, thieves, thieves. Look to your house, your daughter, and your bags. Or choice two: they are all but stomachs, and we all but food. They eat us hungrily, and when they are full, they belch us. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to think. Is it choice one or is it choice two? So if you said choice one, I'm going to push back on you and say that this quote, while it addresses the idea that women or that men have some control over women, right? Because they think about, or because they're saying that marrying Desdemona is just like stealing a possession, right? It's kind of objectifying her. It doesn't talk about or show the effects of that mentality or that viewpoint, that belief, as opposed to choice two, which I think is much more relevant to the claim. It also, choice two, meets that criteria for having really notable language. Women are described as food, men are described as stomachs. It also describes men as eating women. So we have that idea of interesting or strange language. This is defying my expectations. So I have a lot to analyze here. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of selecting strong evidence. If you have any questions, please feel free to email Mr. Garfinkel or me, Ms. Lumetta, and we'll be happy to clarify. Good luck with all of your assignments and preparing for Wednesday's discussion.